Hi, I'm Gary and welcome to my shop. In this video I'm going to show you how to make this Rockler Folding Knife Kit, which is very easy to make. This is a Sarge's knife and it just folds out, folds back in. It's easy to make. Basically the biggest part of it is making the sides of these called the scales. There's a few techniques and tricks to it, but I'll show you how to make that very simple here. Also, with these scales that I made, I did an inlay line in this just as a design I wanted to add to it. Since I was using a black walnut here, I wanted a light contrasting color wood that would make it look good. Very easy to do, and I'll show you how to do this in this video. Okay, this is a Rockler Folding Knife Kit. It's an item number 53335. Right now it's on sale for $14.95. This is the Christmas season 2016, so exactly how long it's going to be on sale I don't know. But it comes with the knife itself. It's a folding knife. I've got the blade taped up because it's very sharp and I don't want to be cutting myself. This other hardware has 7 screws and a pocket clip and a key wrench for putting these screws in. You need 7 screws because you got 2 screws on each side of the handle for the sides, which they call the scales. So you got 2 screws on each side, so that makes for 4 screws there. And then for the pocket clip, takes 3 screws there, so that makes up for 7 screws altogether. This is a Sarge's knife. Very good. Really good deal for the price. You don't get the scales with it, you buy those separately. I'm using a piece of scrap black walnut here. Has a interesting wood pattern. It's kind of sloped a little bit. See, this knife comes with a 7-degree angle on this. So with this, the wood grain matches up pretty well because the wood grain has a slope to it. So I traced that out with this white charcoal pencil. Then this line in the middle here is where I'm going to add in a decorative touch with a laminate. And the piece of poplar I've got left over from some cut off somewhere, but it'll make a perfect piece to put in there for a laminate. So if your wood grain is real straight, then you'd want to cut a 7-degree angle on that so that your wood grain will line up with the handle here. This also comes with instructions, which I've made some notes on. See if I can get this up here so you can see my notes. Those are notes for any peculiarities of making this. I'm going to need to cut out a piece on this on my table saw, a length like that for a workpiece. So what I'm going to do is measure this. I see that the edge of this, so I'm starting out at 4 here on my square, with that lined up with the edge, 3, and then about a 3/4 inch to get to this edge. So since I'm going to be feeding this against this edge against the fence of my table saw, I need to measure in 1 3/4 inch. Turn this around, measure this up at about 1 3/4 inch. That'll be where I'll line up my saw blade on my table saw. So I set up my table saw. I got the blade raised to just be above the workpiece there so I can get good cut. Then I need to move my fence over, line up this white mark with the edge of my blade, clamp down my fence, and I'll be able to turn this on and cut through it. There I have my cut. I've got some extra length here, as I'll need that for doing some testing with the holes for those screws for mounting the scales onto the knife frame. Now my next step is I'm going to take this over to the bandsaw. I'm going to resaw this into 1/4 inch thicknesses, and then I'm going to put it back, the 2 pieces back together again with that double-sided tape. Then I will come back, cut out the pattern, and then I will cut the center line here for the squiggly pattern for the accent piece I'm going to put in. At my bandsaw here, I've set up my fence so that it is a 1/4 inch away from the blade to give me the thickness of the scales that I want for right now to start working with. Okay, so the 2 scales I'm going to work with. What I'll do next is I'll double tape these 2 sides together, and then I'll go back to the bandsaw here. I'll cut out the outside pattern first, then this middle pattern for the inlay that I'm going to put in. Okay, so I have these two pieces here, and I'm going to use some of this double-sided tape. And this tape's a little bit wider than these pieces are, so I'm going to try and carefully get this on here so it's right on the edge. Press that on, and then peel an edge off here. Get that started. You can see that this is the one that's got the pattern on it. So I'm going to press these pieces on, get it so that the bottom edge and this edge here, where the knife marks are good and even on those edges. That's good. Got that pressed on there good. That'll hold it together. So now I can cut out this pattern and have both my left and right handle pieces to it. Then I can do some sanding. What I've decided I'm going to do, instead of cutting out the shape first, then cutting this line for the accent line, I'm going to do this first so that when I glue this back together, put that accent piece in, I've got these two edges to clamp against. If I did it the other way, I don't have any flat surfaces I can clamp well together with, so I'll go ahead and cut this. It's just cutting a gentle sloping line there. It doesn't have to be real precise, but I've tried to follow along the line that I sketched. Okay, so I'm going to cut a piece about the length of this, but because of this curve here, it's going to be a little extra long, so I'm going to make it about like that, and then mark a thickness on this that I want to cut. Like that. So I can be sure to have enough thickness here. A little bit thicker at this end here. Any excess be easily sanded off. Now this is not real precision cutting here. It's just kind of general shape and size. And then our finishing will get it fit perfectly. Then I will be clamping this in together here. I'm going to get it clamped and give me that accent line. These clamps will pull it up tight and it'll look a lot better once it's clamped up and glued. Here I've got the decorative piece in there. Got it all glued and clamped together. So give that time to set up. Then I can come back and trim out the other pieces and then get it all trimmed out. Well, the glue is dried up on that. I'm ready to trim some of this off. Got a lot sticking up on this edge and a little bit on this side. Yeah, what I'm going to try and do here is to see if I can scrape this off with a chisel here. One thing is to try and be careful you don't get your fingers in this. So that'll work, looks pretty good. Now all I got to do is split this apart where the double-sided tape is at. And as part of that process, I'm going to need to cut through the spline here of this decorative trim with a razor knife at the same time. To do that, I'm going to use like one of these Olfa knives. There's a blade that extends out quite a ways. And try and cut through this. The tape part should be easy enough. So what I'm finally doing is clamping this piece, the edges into this clamp, and then sawing through the middle of it with this thin Marples, usually a flush trim saw, and just kind of slowly and carefully working my way through it. And then I have my piece there. And this side also. So, got my two sides. I'll get them cleaned up. Okay, got the two sides cleaned up, so they're ready to go. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to stick these back together again, and then cut out around my pattern line there. And I wanted to cut through here first before I cut the pattern line because I wanted to make sure I could get these apart cleanly without any problems. It'd be a lot harder to try and separate them if I had already cut out that pattern. So now I've got that cut. Tape these back together again and then cut out my pattern. This time I'm going to use thinner strips of this double stick tape. I used the more solid one that filled it up completely before because I wanted to make sure I got good coverage throughout this entire width of that line there. For this part now, all I need is these two pieces and that'll be sufficient for cutting out the pattern. Okay, so I will peel off this protective tape, put these two pieces together, get them kind of evenly matched up on the ends and on the bottoms, press it together so they're stuck together good now. And previously, I was doing the glue up, I was going to mention is that if you can see how this white line curves around here, and what I did, because these parts kind of slip and slide a bit, I made sure to line up these white marks here as closely as I could. That way I'd be pretty close to being square here. And I'll sand this edge a little bit too just to make it even because I can feel a little bit of an edge there. Hey, so I brought this piece over here to the oscillating sander here. Got like a flat sanding belt there. And then I just push this up and score off the end there. I've done that a few times and I've got a nice even edge there now. So that'll be great. Okay, my next step is going to be to go to the bandsaw to cut out this pattern for the scales. But when I put it down, I noticed it was a little bit rocky here. So what I need to do is kind of sand off this backside here to get it smooth so it sits flat on my bandsaw table. So I want to do that here by sanding this a bit on this sander. I think that's pretty good there within reason. So I can go and cut this out at the bandsaw now. At the bandsaw here, I have a 1/4 inch blade in, which is usually good for most curves and shapes. I'm just going to trace this along this pattern here and stay outside that line by about 1/16 of an inch or so to give me space that I can fine tune it and sand it. Okay, so that is looking pretty good. I got close on some of these layout lines here, but given that I added in this laminate strip in here, that's going to make it wider than what my trace was anyway. Okay, now to separate these two halves, I'm going to take a putty knife, just dig in at the line there where the two pieces are together at, and separate them apart. And then I've got my two halves, and this tape just peels off pretty easily. And I can start sanding the inside parts of these scales, like these sides here. I'm going to sand these two inside parts so they're good and smooth to fit onto the side of the knife, and then get the holes drilled for the screws. And I have to do it at a certain depth to make sure that no more than, I think it's 5/64 of the screw is protruding through. I'll talk about more of that as I get into that. So I have my two scales here, and what I want to do is to attach these to the frame of the knife here like this. So what I need to do next is to sand the inside of these scales smooth. I want to do that at my rigid oscillating sander. But these scales are rather thin for me to hold on to with my fingers without sanding away my fingers. So what I'm going to do is to take a piece of wood, some scrap that I've cut out here, and I'm going to hot glue this onto the sides of these scales. It gives me a handle to hold on to while I hold it up to the sander. As you can see here, trying to hold this scale up to this belt sander here is kind of precarious with my fingers without getting my fingers in danger of the sander. Now, this is my rigid oscillating sander, which has the belt sander on it, and it also has spindles that go on there for doing curves and shapes. Very handy tool. My hot glue is getting hot, starting to melt there. I just use a piece of scrap paper here to kind of catch it. Scrap piece of wood here that I'm going to hot glue onto this scale. So what I will do is just apply a little bit of a bead onto this. And then just press it on here and hold it for maybe a minute. And then this sets up and gets hard. Then I can use this as a handle to hold this to the sander. Same with the other piece. Doesn't have to be a perfect thing, just so long as it's on there and it gives you something to grab onto for holding it on there. Then, later on, I will show you how I get this apart with a really neat trick, and that's using some denatured alcohol to get that glue to release quick and easy. Okay, I have my scale with my handle hot glued on there, and what I can do is hold this up to here without endangering my fingers and get this sanded good and smooth. I just want to get this flat and smooth. I'm not trying to reduce the thickness at all because that will be left to the sanding on the other side. Okay, so that has me at a really good smooth surface here for gluing on to the hardware of the knife. Then I will be taking this off and doing the drill holes for the screws for attaching this scale to the side of the hardware of the knife. Now, to remove these handles that I put on from the sides of these scales, I use some denatured alcohol. And I have one of these, what they call a pipette. I think I bought like a bag of 100 of these online on Amazon.com for maybe 10 bucks. But just get a little bit into there. Only takes maybe a drop or two to put on here. And what that does is it makes the glue come apart in perhaps a minute or two. Comes apart just like that. Here I'm going to do a little bit of practice on getting these holes marked and drilled for the scales. Okay, the instructions say to use like a small brad nail, something that will fit through the holes in this handle. I don't have any brad nails that'll fit that size, so I've got this 5/64 drill bit here that I'm going to use, and I'll just set it on there like that with the brad point in and just tap it slightly with a small hammer, and that'll detent it. I want to make sure I get a good alignment there and hold that while I mark the other hole. And if you can see, it gives me these two center punch holes, so to speak. One here, one there. And this is just a test piece here that I'm working with. Next, what I'm going to do is the instructions calls for drilling a hole for the diameter of the screws to go through at 3/32. Then the final diameter to fit the head of the screw is a 5/32. So I'm going to drill a little bit with the 5/32 hole first, because that'll give me a kind of a perimeter for getting that bit started, but I'm just going to start it a little ways, and then I'm going to go to the 3/32 bit to put the hole all the way through. Then I'm going to practice on deepening the depth for the hole, or the head of the screw, into the hole with the 5/32 bit until I get it so that the end of the screw, when it's going through there, is only exposed by 5/64 of an inch or less. So this is a good thing to do to practice on this if you've never done these before. I have my 5/32 drill bit in here. What I'm going to do is bring that down onto that punch mark, and I'm going to drill it down just enough to make a little bit of an indent. Okay, so that's enough to give me a guide point when I want to get this bit started again. Now I'm going to switch out to the 3/32 bit. I want to get on center with the point, brad point, that's in this hole from that previous one. So kind of put this up here and get it around to where it locks into the center there. Then I'll press this down, hold in place, and I'll drill all the way through this piece. So now I've got my hole all the way through. I'll switch back to the 5/32 bit so I can start setting my depths. Okay, got the screw here. Now these are some very tiny parts, so you want to be very careful with this. Got the wrench for using with the screw. Doesn't seem to really slip on there and stay very well. Might could try magnetizing it, but what I'll do is slip this into the hole, try and get it so it goes in there correctly. Okay, kind of getting to go there. You can see on this side how that's starting to come through there a little bit, so I don't need to go down very much. Take this back out. Careful with that screw. So I can get that centered on that. That seems to be about bottom right there, so don't want to go too far, and I kind of judge it by how much I'm watching my shaft extend here. Okay, I've got a protruding there a bit. Grab a little ruler here where I can measure this. That's got 64ths graduations. So I'm, so that's 30 seconds. So that's right about 5/64ths right there. Should be maybe a little bit less, so I should maybe have gone a little bit less deep. That's, you know, the whole thing for practicing with this. Practice makes perfect. Okay, so I kept going through this and trying to barely touch on this when I'm drilling through this side here with that 5/32, and just lightly touching it each time to where I've got it now, where I've got the exposure at about 5/64ths there. So that works really well. That's touchy, and it's just making some very light cuts with the drill bit each time and checking it again. So now I'll move on and do the real scales for this. When you're drilling the depth of this hole for the head of the screw, you probably want to get it a little bit shorter than the 5/64ths, because when the screw goes in and it pulls into the threads on the side of the knife handle hardware, it'll tend to tighten up and it'll tend to compress some of the wood fibers. So when that happens, your end of the screw here is going to wind up protruding out a little bit more than you think. So keep that in mind to try and get to be a tad less than the 5/64ths. You know, probably the 4/64ths would be good, or even 3/64ths. When drilling my knife scales is such a precarious, kind of a delicate operation for drilling these holes, because I did this 5/32 bit, just a short depth, and then used the 3/32 to drill the hole all the way through for the screw. Then the 5/32 is establishing a shoulder for the screw head and going through and holding these scales in place. This is my practice piece here. So on a large drill press like this, it's hard to, you know, be delicate and finesse things very much. So I put a piece of tape on here to give me kind of a visual reference as to where I'm getting to in my practice piece. So I took note of exactly where I hit to get the correct depth for those without going down too far. You know, if I make the shoulder too thin of a material, the head of the screw is just going to kind of break through and not hold very well. Use this tape to give me a visual reference for, you know, getting my depth on there and making sure I don't go too far. Practiced enough before I did the real pieces. Here I'm preparing to line up, mark the scales for the sides of the knife here. I've got one that's a right side and a left side, and these are the inside faces that will go onto the frame of the knife like that. So what I need to do is to mark where to drill the holes for the screws and mounting body onto the sides of these. So what I'm going to do is do this kind of backwards. I'm going to put the right side over on the left side over on the right, and then what I'll do is align this up on the frame. I take a 5/64ths drill bit. That's the only size I've got. I don't have a brad nail or anything that fits here correctly. Then I'll tap this, and what I'm going to do is to secure this in place correctly. So I'm going to put a little piece of double stick tape on here to hold this in correct position while I mark those holes for drilling. So I've put short pieces of double stick tape on each of these scales here, and I'll just peel this off and then align this onto here so it lines up with that there and gives me good alignment all the way around for when I do the trimming or sanding on this, so everything will be covered. Now I'll mark the holes in each of these little holes here. Just a little bit of a tap. Doesn't take much. I'll peel these off, and you can see how I've got my marks on there for drilling my holes. I'll do the same thing for the other side scale. Got my holes drilled in these scales and got the right depths. Drilled a 5/32 hole to make the shoulder on it, and a 3/32 to make the hole go all the way through. And the way I did it is just like I did in that previous clip where I did practice on drilling these. Got my screws into this scale. As you can see, my screw is protruding up through that surface. Like they said, they don't want to go more than about 5/64. So I use is a 5/64 drill bit here to kind of test my depth on it, and that looks pretty good. So now I got to do is attach this to the knife. I'm going to screw it on at first and then get it shaped with the sanding. Then I'll take them off and then use the epoxy glue to attach these scales to that and tighten down the screws. Okay, something I wanted to point out in this kit I didn't discover until late is there's 7 screws in total. 4 screws that go on the 2 sides of the scales, 2 screws on each side, makes for 4. Then you got these 3 screws for the pocket clip that goes on the knife, and they're different lengths. These screws for the pocket clip are much shorter than the screws for the scales. Now the instructions to tell you about this are pretty small and kind of buried in there where I underlined it in red. You can see it very well, and it doesn't make it real clear there that the short screws are for the pocket clip. Something for you to be aware of if you do this particular knife, because the instructions are small and they don't make it real clear. Okay, I have these scales screwed on to the sides of the knife frame here, and I just snugged them up snugly. I didn't crank them down too tight because I don't want to press through the wood or anything yet. And so I'll do is shape this on the sander, come back and take it off, and then put the epoxy glue on underneath there, and then set them back on again. Then I can finish it from there. Now these scales fit very good around here. There's a couple of spots where it's really quite close, but I've got enough excess where it's going to work, so good deal. Now to do some sanding on these handles at my small belt sander here. It's a 1x30. And what I did is on this knife here where the ends meet the metal, I double taped over the metal there to help protect it from the sander as I try and smooth these down here. What I'll do is I shape these around here to get an even edge close to that, and then a little bit of rounding around the edges. And then I'm going to go to my oscillating sander and get this trimmed up to meet the frame of the knife. Get the oscillating sander here. I'm going to go around this to get this trimmed down to the frame of the knife. Okay, so that's looking pretty good there, and then I'll get the rest of it by hand with sandpaper. I got this sanded up and smoothed out with sandpaper, sanding it by hand, and I started out with an 80 grit and then finished off here at 220. Then I'm applying wipe-on poly. It's a hand-rubbed polyurethane that you put on, and I'll do 3 coats of that on there, and it's looking very good. And for drying in between coats, I just put it in a clamp like that to let it dry. Well, to wrap this up, thank you for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you got the inspiration to make something of your own. Please give me a like and share with your family and friends, and please subscribe to see what I may come up with next. Thank you.